Hello everyone. It gives me pleasure to bring before you this presentation on impairment of financial assets and lease transactions. World over, most of the jurisdictions have adopted IFRS, and one of the most important concepts introduced under IFRS is the concept of expected credit losses. The concept of expected credit losses is basically the impairment of financial instruments under IFRS 9. Earlier, incurred credit losses model was used for measuring losses on financial contracts. The difference between the incurred credit losses model and expected credit losses model is the incurred credit losses model delayed the recognition of booking of credit losses until a probable loss event has occurred or incurred. This model was, criticized heavily for restricting an organization's ability to record credit losses that are expected but do not yet meet the probable threshold. Whereas in an expected credit losses model, a forward-looking approach is taken, and accordingly, expected credit losses are computed based on the credit risk a particular asset represents at a particular given point of time. In this presentation, I wish to take you through the impairment provisions relating to financial assets and lease assets. Therefore, the relevant standards in question in the present case are IAS 36 or its equivalent, which deals with impairment of assets, and IFRS 9 or its equivalent, which deals with impairment of financial assets. And also we will touch upon certain parts of IFRS 16 or its equivalent relating to lease transactions. Coming to the so we will first discuss impairment of financial assets, and then we will touch upon the specifics relating to impairment of lease transactions. So impairment of financial assets have to be done as per IFRS 9. It is also known as the expected credit losses model, or ECL. ECL is applicable on certain class of assets. They are trade receivables or debtors, loan commitments, loans, loan receivables or other financial receivables, lease receivables, financial guarantee contracts, and debt instruments. So like we said, there's been a shift from incurred credit losses model to expected credit losses model when it comes to impairment. So earlier the impairment model came into picture only when a particular event of default has occurred or the company has incurred certain losses. But the expected credit losses model assumes a more forward-looking approach where the historical numbers are extrapolated to give a futuristic outlook to the losses based on the credit risk associated with the asset at a given point of time. There are two approaches. The standard provides for two approaches for computing expected credit losses. They are that is the general approach and the simplified approach. In the general approach, all instruments which are otherwise not required to follow simplified approach, general approach is applied on such cases. Simplified approach has to be adopted mandatorily in case of trade receivables not having significant financing component, and it is optional in case of lease receivables and trade receivables having significant financing component. So in case of simplified approach, lifetime expected credit losses have to be provided for, whereas in case of a general approach, a stage-based credit risk assessment is done, and accordingly ECL has to be provided. So we will first talk about general approach, and while discussing it, I think while discussing the lifetime expected credit losses, we will somehow also cover the simplified approach. So in general approach, there are three categories. The assets are categorized into three categories or three stages depending on the credit risk which it reflects. Stage 1, a financial instrument is classified under stage 1 at the inception of the transaction, unless the asset itself is not credit impaired at the time of purchase, or subsequently if the asset does not show any signs of significant increase in credit risk. Stage 2, that is when there is a deterioration in the credit risk and the asset reflects a significant increase in credit risk since its initial recognition. And stage 3 is when the financial assets shows objective evidence of impairment and the asset is credit impaired. In such a situation, we treat the asset as non-performing or stage 3. So if we see, the credit risk is low in stage 1, moderate to high in stage 2, and very high in stage 3, right? In stage 1, if for assets or for instruments classified under stage 1, 12 months expected credit losses is computed. For uh, assets covered under stage 2 and stage 3, lifetime expected credit losses are computed. Now, what is the difference between stage 2 and stage 3? So the difference arises at the time of presentation. In case of stage 2, the ECL is not netted off from the carrying amount of the asset. However, in case of stage 3, the ECL is netted off from the carrying amount of asset, and also the effective interest rate in the transaction is recomputed. Now, there are right. Right. So now, before we actually come to computation, there are certain considerations that one has to consider while staging or classifying the assets under different stages. They are: number one, the transition. In natural course, before a financial asset moves from stage 1 to stage 3, that is from performing to not performing, it flows through a timeline of credit weaknesses or a deterioration in the credit quality, and accordingly that should be captured while classifying the assets into different stages. So therefore, when I bring in a performing asset in my books, it remains performing. Subsequently, it has to show signs of significant increase in credit risk, and then only then it should go or meet the conditions for default. The second one, time to maturity. Time to maturity is an important indication for credit risk. For example, a AAA bond with original maturity of 5 years will have far lesser risk when compared to a AAA bond with a 10-year maturity. Therefore, while assessing the credit risk, one has to also keep in mind the remaining time to maturity. This logic, however, may not hold good when the transactions involve different payment structures. Like, for example, if a bond carries, or if a instrument carries a balloon repayment structure or a bullet repayment structure, these considerations relating to time to maturity does not hold good. Significant increase in credit risk, or to determine whether or assessment of whether there is a significant increase in credit risk is also an important factor while computing or while staging a particular asset. Usually, the assessment of credit risk is left with the management. However, the standard says that if reasonable and supportable forward-looking information is available without undue cost or effort, an entity cannot rely solely on past due information when determining the credit risk. However, there is a rebuttable presumption that credit risk on a financial asset has increased significantly since its initial recognition when the contractual payments are more than 30 days past due. Now, we need to understand this is a rebuttable presumption. One can, come up with one can easily rebut the presumption and adopt otherwise. For instance, In India, the Reserve Bank of India has come out with a guidance on implementation of Indian accounting standards for NBFCs. It states that though the Ind AS 109, or the equivalent of IFRS 9 in India, states that for to assess whether um, there is significant increase in credit risk, one has to see whether the receivables have remained delinquent for more than 30 days or not. But if the management deems appropriate, it can rebut the presumption and yet not treat it as a significant increase in credit risk, even though the uh, delinquency of the receivables have exceeded 30 days. But such, I mean, it should be supported by a justification which would be taken to the audit committee also and accordingly recorded. Similarly, if there could be situations where an uh, an asset or an account reflects signs of default even before 30 days, even before it has remained overdue for 30 days. So when in such cases, one can rebut the presumption and treat it as stage 3 from the very, I mean, even before it crosses the 30-day mark. So now we come to the computation of expected credit losses. Expected credit losses is basically the present value of all cash shortfalls, and cash shortfalls is basically the difference between the contractual cash flows due to the entity, or what the original, I mean, the cash flows as per the originally agreed terms or originally agreement between the parties, and the cash flow the entity expects to receive over a period of time. Once again, cash shortfall is therefore the difference between the contractual cash flows due to the entity and the expected cash flows from the asset. Now, these cash shortfalls are then discounted at the effective interest rate or a risk adjusted interest rate, depending on the assumptions made by the management. Now, it is very important to note there are certain considerations that needs to be taken care of while doing this computation. The evaluation has to be done on a probability weighted approach, using a probability weighted approach, which means different probabilities must be assessed on the reporting date with respect to the cash flows, and accordingly different weights must be assigned, and the total final outcome should be a probability weighted outcome. Now, with respect to computation of expected credit losses, there could be several ways of computing expected credit losses. But in this presentation, we have drawn reference from the internal ratings based approach of Basel III capital regulations, which says expected credit losses is a function of the probability of default, the loss given default, the exposure at default, and the discounting rate. Now we will discuss each of these points one by one. Starting with probability of default. Probability of default basically is the probability of default is one of the most important components of computing ECL. For entities which follow internal risk-based approach, it is basically an outcome of the IRB. However, where a reporting entity does not follow an IRB approach, a scorecard approach may be adopted for the same. In a scorecard approach, various factors specific to the asset and the borrower are weighted to assess the credit risk and produce a certain PD level. For example, I mean, while there could be borrower specific issues, but with respect to assets, for a lot of weightage is given to the quality of collateral or recoverability of the collateral. For example, for personal use assets like cars, two-wheelers, these may be assigned a lower risk weight because the repayment in these cases depend on the other, the income profile of the borrower, and it has nothing to do with the asset itself. Whereas for income generating assets like construction equipments, farming equipments, infrastructure equipments, where repayment depend on the generation of cash flows from the asset, a higher risk weight may be assigned to such assets. Now, once we arrive at the credit risk, the PD levels are produced through either through a vintage analysis, which assesses the default rates, how it changes over a period of time, and then gives us a PD level, or where similar, I mean, data for similar tenure of loans are not available, we can extrapolate the trends and we can get a PD level. Now, usually these PD levels, since we are drawing it based on historical data, um, these are representations of performance of similar assets in the past. However, as we noted earlier, in an ECL model, a forward-looking approach has to be adopted. So therefore, these PD levels, the historically data produced, I mean the PD levels produced from historical data, has to be calibrated to give a forward-looking effect. Right? Now, moving on to the next item, that is loss given default. Loss given default basically signifies what proportion of your exposure will actually be lost should there be default. So if the amount of default is 100 rupees and I recover 80 rupees over a period of time, that would mean the loss given default is 20 rupees. Therefore, loss given default is a function of, or is can be denoted by 1 minus recovery rate. Now, while computing loss given defaults, there could be, one has to apply or keep in mind several considerations with respect to how much cash flows the asset would fetch in future, or what could be the future valuation of the asset, or how much time will it take to realize the proceeds from the assets, or what is the cure rate, or what are the external costs associated with the realization of asset, and so on and so forth. And also, I mean, these factors could differ with with assets. For different assets there could be different, there'll have to be different assumptions, and similar assets located in different geographies could have different implications. So one has to keep in mind the macroeconomic factors, the demographics, etc., associated with the transaction while computing what is the loss given default. Now, the next factor is exposure at default, EAD. Exposure at default is basically the outstanding exposure on the reporting date for which the expected credit losses are being computed. And lastly, the discounting rate. It is used to discount the credit losses computed at different points of time. Usually, we discount it at the deal IRR. Now, I have tried to do a Excel, I mean, try to project it through an Excel working. I'll just present that. Right. So in this, I have drawn up a mock schedule where these are periods. It's a 5-year tenure loan, and the cash flows. So the initial exposure is 1 lakh, and I'm expecting to get back 25,000 each year for 5 years. So based on that, I have computed effective interest rate, or the IRR, using the IRR formula. That gives me an EIR of 7.93%. Now, using this EIR, I have drawn up an amortization schedule, and which gives me closing costs at, or closing principal outstanding at different periods, and at the end of different periods. This basically gives us the exposure at default at different point of time. Now, if recall from the presentation, expected credit losses is computed as probability of default multiplied by the loss given default multiplied by the exposure at default discounted at the EIR for the relevant period. Now, moving on to the computation of ECL. So like I said, the exposures of default is exposures at default at different points of time have been taken from the closing POS from the amortization schedule. So here we can see for the first period the closing POS was 1 lakh. So this is 1 lakh, and so on and so forth. It goes on. These are assumptions, like, though there are detailed workings that go behind computation of probability of the default, but in the present case we have assumed the PD levels at 3%, 3%, 4%, 4%, and these are cumulative probabilities of default. Similarly, I have also assumed loss given default. Like I said, like we discussed some time back, there are detailed considerations while computing LGDs as well. But in the present case, I have taken up mock numbers and done the exercise. The EIR is same as 7.93%, which we computed. Now we compute the marginal ECL. So the marginal ECL is therefore the B16 is the exposure at default. C16 represents the probability of default, and E16 represents the loss given default. And it has been discounted at the EIR for the given period. So that gives me an expected credit loss of 555.91 for the first period. Similarly, I have done it for the next 5 periods. Now, these are already discounted shortfalls. So now when we compute the expected credit losses, if standing on at the end of the first period, if I were to compute 12 months expected credit losses, then it would have been 555.91. Whereas if I were to compute lifetime expected credit losses, it would have been 168.49, which is basically the sum total of all these marginal expected credit losses. Now, there could be several, I mean, in reality, the computation would be much complex. And each of these, like I said, each of these factors would require detailed deliberations and detailed analysis, which could involve statistical tools as well to arrive at the PD levels or LGD levels. And based on that, the expected credit losses are computed. Now, getting back to the presentation. So this was all about expected credit losses under IFRS 9. Now we will move to the next part of the presentation, that is impairment of lease transactions. So impairment of lease transactions would differ with the who we are doing it, who is the reporting entity, whether it is a lessor or it's a lessee, and also would depend based on the lease classification. Now we will start with impairment in the books of lessor. So to start with, so lease classification, in terms of lease classification, there could be two types of leases: financial leases and operating leases. They are we have detailed notes on lease classification, and which we have embedded in the description to this video. Should you be interested in going through them, please do feel free. So financial lease and operating lease. In case of financial leases, in the books of the lessor, the entire asset is booked as lease receivables or financial receivables. So the moment we talk about financial receivables, IFRS 9 comes into picture, and expected credit losses impairment is done as per the expected credit losses model under IFRS 9. In case of operating leases, unlike financial leases, the actual asset or the tangible asset or the lease asset gets capitalized in the books of the lessor, and it is recognized under property, plant and equipment. Now, property, plant and equipments are undergo impairment under a different accounting standard, and that is IAS 36, which specifically deals with impairment of assets. And for lease receivables which come on the books, I mean, lease receivables coming from an operating lease would come on the books only if there is an event of default, or only if they have remained overdue for a particular period of time. Only then they'll come as trade receivables in the books of the lessor. So once it comes on the books of the lessor, These receivables would also undergo an impairment testing under IFRS 9 because now they have become financial instruments. Once they become financial instruments, they fall under the purview of IFRS 9. So, therefore, to summarize, in case of operating lease, there are two standards that would be applicable. One, IAS 36, that would deal with impairment of the asset or of the leased asset, and IFRS 9 that would deal with impairment of the lease receivables that comes into the books of the lessor upon default. In the books of the lessee, um, so one of the here, I mean, I'll have to divert the topic a bit to give you a perspective. Under IFRS 16, there's a significant change in the way lease transactions are accounted for in the books of the lessee. Earlier, under the earlier accounting standard on leases, in the books of lessee, the assets came onto the books of the lessee only in case of a financial lease, because um, it caused in the financial leases cause a significant transfer of risk and reward in the assets, and therefore the asset is capitalized in the books of the lessee, whereas the lessor only recognizes receivables. But and in case of operating lease, the risks and rewards are retained by the lessor. Hence, it is capitalized in the books of the lessor, which is the same. The treatment in the books of the lessor is the same under IFRS 16 as it was under the earlier accounting standard. But in the books of the lessee, irrespective of whether it is a financial lease or an operating lease, the asset comes on the books. In case of an operating lease, the asset comes on the books as a right of use asset. So the lessee has to recognize the right of using the asset on its books, and it usually comes under property, plant and equipment. So the moment it comes under property, plant and equipment, it has to undergo impairment testing under IAS 36. Now we will talk about the impairment testing under IAS 36. So the requirement to impair an asset under IAS 36 gets triggered only when the following indications are noticed. So there are some external indicators and internal indicators provided in the standard. However, these are only indicative in nature. There could be more, but these are the minimum indicators one should consider. So external indicators include significant decline in market value, change in technology, market, economic or legal environment, change in the interest rate prevailing in the market, and where the carrying value is more than the um, market value of the property or the capitalized value. Internal indicators include assets performance, decline in the performance of the asset, discontinuance or restructuring of the asset, and where there is an evidence of physical obsolescence. Under these, if any of these indicators are seen, then one has to do an impairment testing for the asset. Now, under IAS 36, all the assets are treated as cash generating units. Similarly, in case of lease transactions, each asset on lease would be treated as CGU for the purpose of impairment testing. The impairment loss is calculated based on the carrying value of the asset and the recoverable value of the asset. Now, if the recoverable value of the asset is lower, turns out to be lower than the carrying value of the asset, then it is deemed that the asset is impaired. Now, the recoverable value is the higher of the fair value of the asset, net of cost of disposal, if any, and the value in use. Now, fair value of the asset is where is computed, is arrived at based on the fair valuation of the asset. The fair valuation is usually done based on internationally accepted valuation principles, and from that the cost of disposal has to be reduced. Cost of disposal usually would include legal cost, stamp duty, cost of removing the assets, incremental costs for bringing the assets into conditions for its sale, and other costs incidental to the removal of the asset. And value in use is computed based on the present value of all the future cash flows of the asset. Now, one is to understand that since we are dealing with stress assets, we are aware of inherent stresses in the asset. The cash flows that we considered for computing the value in use should be appropriately risk weighted, or probabilities of collection of the receivable should be factored while arriving or while considering the cash flows. Now there are two ways of doing it. Either we assign risk weights to the cash flows, or instead of doing that we take the original cash flows and we make adjustments in the discounting rate, right? In any event, the probabilities of recovery or whatever adjustments we make to the discounting rate, these adjustments should corroborate with the risks associated or risk the particular asset is reflecting at a given point of time, right? And if the recoverable value is, like I said, if the recoverable value, which is the higher of the fair value of the asset or value in use, is lower than the carrying amount, then the difference between the two has to be booked as an impairment loss, and the carrying amount of the asset also has to be reduced to that extent. So therefore, two adjustments: the impairment loss will be booked in the profit and loss, and appropriate and accordingly, and also the value of the asset or the carrying value of the asset in the balance sheet will be reduced. Now this is about impairment in the books of the lessee. Now before we conclude, therefore I would like to summarize the discussion so far. Impairment of physical assets is done in accordance with IAS 36, where the recoverable, we want us to compute what is the recoverable value. If the recoverable value is lower than the carrying value, then it is considered that an impairment has hit, or impairment or the asset is subject to impairment, and accordingly impairment losses are to be computed. Impairment of financial assets are done as per the expected credit losses model under IFRS, which basically involves a forward-looking approach for estimation of impairment losses. And this is basically the present value of the cash shortfalls from the asset that one assesses. There are two approaches: the general approach or the simplified approach. In a general approach, a stage-wise credit risk assessment is carried out to determine whether the asset in question attracts a 12 months expected credit loss, or whether it attracts a lifetime expected credit losses. In simplified approach, which is mandatory for trade receivables not having significant financing component and optional for trade receivables involving significant financing element and lease receivables, lifetime expected credit losses are computed. So that is all that I had to say in this presentation. I would be I would expect you to also share your feedback, if any. You can write to me at abhiroop@vinodkothari.com, or you can post your queries or comments in the comment section